Just as a quick refresher, if any of you don't know who we are, we're the State Geologic Survey. We have a variety of different things that we do besides water that also relate to water data. So thinking about geologic mapping comes to bear with aquifer characterization, looking at oil and gas, energy sector, and our geothermal. There's a lot of deep wells that we can pull information from. We have labs here, outreach program, and our water programs, which are now 3 different programs that are kind of under this umbrella. So that includes aquifer mapping and monitoring. We do within that a number of different small scale and larger regional studies, looking at quantity and quality, applying a variety of techniques to understand that, including geophysics and groundwater level measurements and sampling of water quality, looking at existing wells for the most part so far in the years that we've been doing this. And then we have a program right now that's funded by Healy Foundation that supports us to get groundwater level measurements from existing wells around the state. In 2018, the Water Data Act was passed, and that put us as the convening agency working with multiple other state agencies to make our water data more accessible and even integrated so that similar data sets from multiple sources are able to be brought together and quickly accessed. And right now, we've been working heavily on groundwater level data as an integrated resource. And I can help people find that if you're interested in that topic. Water education program is a new one that's just recently been funded firmly here at the Bureau, and that is outreach and education for legislators and other water leaders, including tribal members in the leadership roles around water. And we get people out similar to what we used to do in the decision makers conferences. Really, the idea is to get people a little bit outdoors to see the resources and what the challenges are. So sometimes this comes up where we can talk about aquifer characterization or brackish water if there's an opportunity to highlight that at these workshops. So I think this is all going to be refresher for many of you. And I know Mike Hightower is probably tired of hearing me talk about geology, but I do like to mention that it's not a simple and straightforward state to have this aquifer characterization happen in. Geology is quite diverse and buggered up by fault and volcanic materials that make simple, what seems like a simple question to answer about how much groundwater is available or what is water quality, straightforward sort of question, harder to answer in a state like New Mexico. It's complicated for us because over the years, while we've had an aquifer mapping program, the funding has been smallish. So that limits the ability for our group to collect much new data. So this is the program, aquifer mapping program funding since 2006 when it officially became a concept. And it hovers around $250,000 to $300,000 a year. So that supports a few staff members, and we supplement that with outside grants and contracts. So you can see the blue bar on this chart has been our state funding to support the program and try to answer all these hard questions in the state with complicated geology. And then this year, 2025 fiscal year, we received $600,000 of increased budget. And that has really kind of alerted us to the fact that New Mexico is ready to get going on aquifer characterization. So that's how our funding has looked over the years. And what that's brought for us is coverage of aquifer mapping of different types around the state. The map here on the right shows places where we've worked and done some components of aquifer characterization. All the areas in gray have been studied to some extent, either a water quantity or water quality characteristics. The areas in green are active projects right now underway at the Bureau. So kind of related to that funding slide a moment ago, I think it's important to note that all of these projects have some results, but because they may have been funded by a grant or a municipality or a county, they had very specific questions that they wanted to answer. And so it may not, because it's grayed out or green right now, it may not have the complete aquifer characterization that we aim to achieve in future years. So that's just a little caveat to that. You guys have probably seen this before. This is just to kind of highlight some of the work that we've done in the past, back in 2016, where we compiled a bunch of water quality information from around the state and summarized the brackish water. This map has been used frequently to say that these are the aquifers where brackish water may exist. When I would take this map as more of a cartoon to say, we looked at data in these regions, and this is a summary of what that data said. So this is just kind of a way for us to simplify what is actually fairly sparse data and fairly more complicated brackish water, different types of brackish water. So some places where we see the most saline water being the Tularosa Basin, the Roswell Basin, and the Capitan Reef. I think those are still considered fairly brackish. Thinking about the potential for deep, non-potable water rights using the rules under the State Engineer's Office, we just took a quick look at what data exists for wells, water wells in particular, that are more than 2,500 feet deep. That is the category, and more than 1,000 parts per million total dissolved solids. And this map has 93 points on it. That's the total number of wells that we have on record for water that are over that depth. And actually, a good number of them are blue points on the map, which you can maybe see. I would say about a quarter of them are less than 1,000 parts per million total dissolved solids. So just because it's deep doesn't mean it's salty. So I think that just kind of highlights that complicated factor of the geology of New Mexico, that we have a mixed bag, different depths, different units. So I think the bullet points that are listed here are kind of the takeaway from that brackish water study. And I think the main thing to highlight is that we could really benefit from having some regionally specific studies with exploratory wells drilled for the purpose of characterizing the geology, the water quality, and those aquifer properties, so that we can move forward on actually understanding and perhaps utilizing these brackish water resources. So this is kind of the laundry list of things that need some investment. I think the really big price tag items are the two at the top: drilling exploratory wells, especially if we're going to go to that depth of 2,500 feet deep or more. That is some specialized drilling and geophysical characterization. There's a lot we can do to interpolate between well locations, either existing wells in water or existing wells in other realms like oil and gas, using some of these different geophysical tools like seismic or airborne electromagnetic resistivity surveys, or even basin structure examinations using aerially collected magnetic data can help us really understand the shape of our basins in more detail. So those two things are going to be really helpful for us to characterize some of these places where we really have limited information. And I would say those places where we have very limited information are pretty much places beyond Albuquerque. The Albuquerque Basin is fairly well characterized. And then the Santa Fe area, Espanola Basin, and to some extent the Lower Rio Grande. So those areas, I feel like we have a good start, and a lot of the rest of the state is kind of a black hole. In the deeper realms, especially, the San Juan Basin does have, and the southeast part, of course, has good oil and gas data to build from. One of the important things that we, I think, need to think about with these deep or shallow, potentially brackish water wells is doing long-term testing to see how long they will hold up. Some of those resources are not recharged. So thinking about how the aquifer will behave long-term, and then also establishing long-term monitoring with open and accessible data are, I think, other key features to be considering. Just for a little bit of background on things that we have going on right now that relate, we have a project right now funded by Thornburg Foundation to develop groundwater summaries, and those are longer, 20-page-ish summaries at a kind of a technical level. And then we're using those longer reports and kind of boiling them down to fact sheet levels that could be used for the next round of regional water planning, Water Security Planning Act implementation, and also just basic public education about groundwater. The regions approximately look like these large 10 regions on the map on the right. So we're taking very large regions and creating a summary document that can be a good technical go-to place for folks to learn about what we know about the aquifers in those regions. And then the other thing that we're working on is developing a state map that looks something like the one behind me. This is the geologic map behind me, but our goal is to create a aquifer map that could be a large wall printed map that has the two-dimensional boundaries of our major and minor aquifers. The map on the screen right now is the USGS primary aquifers, and so we can build from something like this and improve and kind of make it more regionally specific to New Mexico. So that's coming along, and right now that is funded by ARPA funding at OSC, and that will be, I think, a first draft will be ready this summer, fall 2025, and then we'll be going through production phases in the following months after that, hopefully available to the public in 2026 with that printed map. You might recognize some faces in this image. This is just to highlight that the Water Data Act has been going on for almost 6 years now, and a lot of data has come together. The two main ways that we're getting data out are through a data catalog. The URL is listed here, catalog.newmexicowaterdata.org. This is like a clearinghouse of all of the data that we have located so far. It's searchable in a variety of ways, but also undergoing improvements right now to make it more user-friendly and have metadata that's searchable and perhaps geolocated in a more spatial-friendly search tool. But the idea behind the Water Data Act isn't necessarily to put everything into a database or a data catalog, but rather that the people who provide data to make it available in a federated open data model. And that is typically done by exposing the data through a application programming interface, an API. And so since the Water Data Act passed, there have been numerous new APIs with water data. The OCD now has, at MNERD, now has something like 100 different APIs sharing data out that people have been previously downloading and accessing through an FTP site. So now a lot of that data is directly accessible and queryable. Computer-to-computer language can start pulling that through and make web maps and dashboards and other tools. Some of this is preliminary, still being tested, but I think there's a lot of new data being shared out that way. NMDA has several new APIs, and I know there's been talk about new links to OSC Water's database through this kind of a format. So our team here at the Bureau of Geology is convening this, and we have been working to pull some of those APIs together and create visualizations and tools that people can basically go to a map, lasso the region that they're interested in, and download data from multiple organizations, multiple sources all at once, and bring that into their spreadsheets or GIS desktop and explore that data that way. There's a lot more we can do, and it's nice to see some of the agencies now getting funding to do this work in their IT groups. I just want to highlight that groundwater monitoring is a big part of what we're trying to improve on with our funding requests. The coverage of groundwater level monitoring, which is a proxy for maybe aquifer health and understanding where places that might be declining and of greater concern are. The map here shows the gray dots are locations that are measured at least annually by the USGS in a cooperative agreement with the state engineer's office. It's about 600 wells that get touched annually, about 100 or less than 100 of those are set up with some sort of continuous monitoring, so that I think it's probably more like 30 that are tracking groundwater levels in real time. And then our network is this collaborative network. We measure private domestic wells, irrigation wells, community water system wells, about 200 that we visit annually on our team, and then about another 400 that are shared to us from data providers. And this helps us kind of have a sense of where is groundwater level monitoring. And you can see, perhaps based on this map, there's a lot of spaces that do not have any groundwater level monitoring happening. And so because these wells are typically irrigation wells or domestic wells, they aren't necessarily the best places to track deeper aquifers or even to track the aquifer at all. Some of them we don't even have a depth from of what formation they might be tracking. So there's a lot of improvement that we can do to either drill wells specifically for monitoring and then set them up with telemetry so that they are measured frequently enough for the area and the regional concerns. But also, I think it's important to get all the way through the formation, or if there are multiple aquifers at depth, drill and set wells to track each of those aquifers and not just the uppermost. One of those data features I was just talking about that has come together through the Water Data Act is putting together all the groundwater level data. We have a quick map that we built for one of our projects that shows increasing or decreasing water level trends based on a little symbology and a basic algorithm going on in the background. But this map brings together data from the USGS and our network and a few other smaller regional networks, and kind of just gives you a quick snapshot on that given day what the trends are in groundwater levels, and you can click on the points to get a hydrograph and see what those trends are. But having something like this that is built perhaps with dedicated monitoring wells can be even more informative. And that brings us to what we're trying to do right now, which is respond to the governor's 50-year water action plan under the category of new water supplies. One of the big topics was improving groundwater mapping and monitoring. And based on the governor's suggestions here, the idea is that our agency is tasked with getting the funding and then characterizing all of the major and minor aquifers, both the fresh and the brackish water, characterize those major aquifers by 2032, which every day that ticks by, I get a little bit more panicked, but we'll get there. And building a statewide groundwater monitoring network with at least 100 wells dedicated for monitoring by 2037. So those are the things in that plan. I just kind of want to lay out for you what we think that looks like in terms of really characterizing the aquifers. So the first step, as with any good research project, is to get the data you already have. So leveraging the work that the Water Data Initiative, Water Data Act has been doing for the last few years, we have a good start. Put together information from existing wells, water and other wells, collect all the geologic mapping and hydrologic data, other geophysical surveys that exist, that's underway right now, compiling that information, and then any geochemistry results. And then with that, we put together an initial model or map of some type so that we can then evaluate where do we see some of the biggest gaps and how can we, in that geology, what is the most appropriate way to fill those gaps? So in some places, it's going to be drilling wells. Some places we might want to do geophysical surveys first and then drill some wells. We'll bring in geologic mappers and then also use the wells and information that's available already, existing wells, and see what we can learn from groundwater level changes or geochemical sampling, and then bring all that new data together back into our maps and models. And then establish any wells that we drill for exploration. The idea is to set those up, ones that are in ideal locations that aren't problematic for various reasons. There could be some wells that we end up setting up as long-term monitoring sites. So any well drilling we do would be collecting a ton of new data going down through the subsurface, and then in those nicely suited locations and ones where we can get multiple different depths, we might set up a piezometer and use those for long-term monitoring with telemetred data. So this is kind of, for some of you who think more in terms of flow diagrams, perhaps this helps. This is the same kind of concept, but the idea is that we're right now in this phase 0, which is database development and building all of the data types that we need to really evaluate the data gaps. Was there a question? I heard a loud noise.
Yes, Stacy.
Yeah.
Keith. Yeah, Stacy, about how much does it cost per well to do the drilling, the monitoring, and the characterization, just roughly?
Yeah, it depends on the depth and the geology. For our estimation purposes, I keep saying I want to drill deeper than we have to. So I would rather not drill these as like shallow aquifer or shallow monitoring wells. I'd rather see how far we can go, perhaps aiming for about 3,000 feet in certain areas. So using that number, let's just say 3,000 feet, our estimate is somewhere between $2 to $4 million per well, depending on what the complicated factors are in the geology. The average we're using for most of these wells is about $3 million per well. So, and it's a lot of new data, bringing out basically a lot of the techniques used in the oil and gas realm to go, downhole surveys and water sampling and imaging that we could use to further characterize what's.
The layman's got a question. Stacy.
Yeah.
After this is done, and it's obviously $100 million at a minimum, if you're talking $2 to $3 million.
Yeah.
How long will this take?
Yeah.
And at the end of the journey from digging to analyzing to saying this is okay to desalinate this aquifer, how many years are we out before that actually transpires? Is it 10 years?
Yeah, so I think, one way to look at this is, in the last slide, I was thinking it's about 2 to 3 years per region. So that's one way to think about it. Like if we know right now that we want to focus on, some part of the San Juan Basin, I'm just saying for example, I think that the workflow could go pretty quickly in that 2 to 3 year range per region. It really depends on the funding that's available. Some of our legislators are asking me, if we give you more money, can you go even faster? Some of that is also dependent on the resources we have available. Do we have enough drilling crews available? Do we have enough various geophysical data processing staff available? And it's going to be folks here, but a lot of it is going to be consultants and contractors and perhaps USGS and other research universities and national labs that are contributing to parts of this project. I don't know that we have the bandwidth in the state of New Mexico alone to get this all done in the time frame of a legislator's career. So our estimate, based on the trajectory that the governor has tasked us with, was 2037 overall to have this done by. I think is that 15 years-ish? 12 to 15 years is the time frame, and our budget for that in total, we estimate is $175 million. So I think how long it will take depends on the funding that becomes available. We can go faster, but to an extent when we hit the limit of human capacity. And so that's kind of a vague answer to your question. But I think that we could probably have regions, if we identified priority regions, perhaps for desal, that we could work through. We could have answers to some of the key questions about those aquifers in probably a few years. Yeah. And I think this slide kind of shows that process. So our idea is to put together the statewide data, all of the data that we might need. In the next 6 to 12 months, we'll have that built. And then start developing what is our priority areas. And I think this group is a really important group to hear from. As we think about that, is we're selecting regions that, there's different criteria we could be evaluating against, whether that's, the cost of some areas is going to be higher because there's literally no data. the impact. The region that is perhaps in greatest need might have a higher impact. So we are going to prioritize certain regions and move forward into the next phase of this, which is really building those three-dimensional models and GIS products so that we can figure out where we need to explore and drill wells, and then add in that geophysical data collection in some areas, then kind of go through the whole process of rebuilding models and coming out with this integrated data set and kind of estimate the water volume available and what that water quality looks like. So this is kind of a work in progress slide, but I'd love to get your guys' input on phases of this, resources we might need to utilize. I'm open to figuring this whole thing out. You guys know this, but once we get it all, we put it together and figure out where the brackish water is, figure out where the fresh water is, where the very saline is. And I think that this is very feasible with a bit more data. Thinking also that there's a lot of other uses of this data. We can better understand where recharge is happening. We can also think about managed aquifer recharge projects that we can do to improve freshwater aquifers. I know in some countries they're taking their brackish water, they're desalinating it and putting it back into the ground to supplement their freshwater aquifers. So maybe there's options for that, as well as thinking about waste disposal. If we have greater characterization of the overall framework of these basins in New Mexico and of our regional aquifers, we can do a lot more to evaluate options for waste disposal. So if we were doing desal, maybe reinjection at certain depths is more clear and understandable. Okay, now getting to the money aspects of this. So kind of thinking about that long-term timeline that the governor's plan outlines, which of course is just a target. The funding that we're looking to get overall is, I think highlighted down here, is $175 million in non-recurring funding to accomplish this work over about 12 years. And that is absolutely has to include working with consultants, working with engineers, working with various sections of the USGS or other federal agencies that have a role, have a skill set in aspects of this or the modeling, working with the academic universities here in New Mexico. I think it's going to also be really important because we need to rebuild our staff, our teams. We need more people here that are able to understand and work with this data. Our goal in the session right now is that our funding request for the aquifer characterization and monitoring efforts that are needed is to get an additional $1.25 million in recurring costs. That is a part of what our overall agency budget request went in as, which was $1.8 million increase to our recurring budget request. There are a couple other things in that related to seismic and geologic hazards and our water data program. Our non-recurring request that went in this year, and this is all through New Mexico Tech, through higher ed, because we are under that section of state government, our request, because they wouldn't let me put in a $175 million request, we asked for $28.75 million. And that the idea is to begin this effort as a pilot, pick a few regions and get going on this in the first, I think through that, hoping that time frame is about 3 years to expend that funding, and then continue to work toward that 175, kind of chip away at that year by year. The executive budget recommendation came out basically fully supporting all of this, the 1.8 million overall agency request, plus the 28.75 million non-recurring request. John, you mentioned in the legislation, is it 127 or 137 House bill, it has 29 or 28.7 million. I think that comes from this. That comes from our budget request that went into HED. What I understand is that they are kind of marking that as a priority in that legislation, but it's expected to come into House Bill 2, or it's supported by the executive recommendation. So I don't think that that bill will proceed with appropriations on it as it goes through the process. The LFC budget rec, and what's showing up now in House Bill 2 is a $500,000 recurring budget increase for our agency. That's getting us closer to 1.25 million for aquifer characterization, and then an addition of 19 million. So they took about 10 million off of our pilot project funding request, and they put in 19 million in non-recurring. And I think we'll have to go and negotiate with them the timeline on that funding. Of course, that's going to be hopefully a 3-year have a extension on the timeline for that. But I think that's it. That's my contact info.